And so I think that's kind of what we're here for today is acknowledging both the fascination that people have with these topics, their own personal experiences, but there is also this sense that, am I crazy? And I think that's a big factor for why people might have fear or reservations around the topic. And I think it's one of the great successes of IONS is that people all over the world maybe have had these experiences. They haven't wanted to talk about it. They didn't want to be seen as, far out or out of the ordinary. They certainly didn't want to be embarrassed by telling people who might think that they're, loopy. And coming together with a community of people who accept the conversation and
Yeah.
accept, that you're not crazy to have had some experiences that push your worldview.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. We had promised to do a little bit of historical perspective on this topic of the fear of psi. So I looked up what Frederick Myers had to say about it. And for those of you who don't know Frederick Myers, he was the founder of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And so, very important person that helped establish the foundations for parapsychology. Now, this is a long, long time ago, right? So I've discerned like two main points that he had relevant to this in terms of the fear. The first one is basically cultural conditioning. So he talked about the subliminal self and recognized that the fear of psi could stem from society's, basically the materialistic approach or the worldview, the paradigm, and that people react defensively to phenomena that challenge their worldview. And this makes sense to me now as a neuroscientist because the brain's primary job is to keep us safe. Its first job is not to get you, the fancy car you want. It's really just to keep you safe. And so that's been wired into us from the beginning. And so it's constantly scanning for danger underneath all of our monkey mind chatter. And there's lots of brain regions and scanning stuff that I could share, but I guess the headliner would be the amygdala. That's the part of the brain that's kind of famous for scanning for fear. And again, it's not just physical fear, it's basically your thoughts, like imaginations of fears. So you're constantly trying to protect from psychological threats as well. So this challenge to a worldview is picked up by the amygdala because it's your brain is trying to maintain stability and predictability. It's defensive reaction. So this is bubbles up from beneath your thoughts, and it's always there. So I think that's a really key factor underneath of this that you don't necessarily recognize. And I I think that so worldview challenge is one thing. I've got more. Um, I wanted to talk also about the psychological resistance. So Myers also mentioned about psychological resistance and these like abilities, they blur the boundaries between ourselves and particularly in terms of transparency. So this other story I wanted to share is that when I was a teenager, my dad was a hypnotist and he would hypnotize people to help them stop smoking and stuff like that. So I was like, oh, hypnotize me so I can study better and I can get better grades in school. So we tried it like three times. It just wouldn't work. He couldn't hypnotize me no matter how much I wanted it. And a little bit at that time, and very much so in hindsight, I think about it was doomed to fail because I was a teenager. I didn't want my dad to have access to everything going on inside me. There were some things I wanted to keep cloaked. And so I think that part of myself just like, nope, I'm not going to let this happen. Even though the front part of my mind was saying, I want this, this protective mechanism was putting up this boundary. How do you think that I've analyzed myself correctly?
Well, that fight or flight response is really powerful. And I think that, as you have pointed out so well, we can think things at the surface level, but what comes beyond that, what really controls our behavior, is something we don't have any conscious awareness of. And that's one of the great conundrums of, existence. We think we are behaving in a way that's rational. We think that we have agency over our behavior. And lo and behold, there are those little uh, goblins that are controlling how we think and how we talk and what we believe in. But another person that I think took off on Frederick Myers was Charles Tart. And Charlie was, a fellow at IONS. He was a pioneer in the field of parapsychology, one of the greats in terms of transpersonal psychology, really trying to understand the essence of our spiritual and psychological being. And he talked a lot about the fear of psi. And this had a lot to do with the replication problem in parapsychology. So, scientists have certain standards, and one of the cornerstones of good science is replication. And it's continuing to be one of those thorny topics that haunts researchers in this field. And there's a whole big dialogue going on right now amongst the parapsychology community. Anyway, Tart was always an advocate for understanding, like William James, radical empiricism. Whatever experiences people have are a legitimate domain for scientific inquiry. So we should be able to do this. And yet people are afraid of it. And they are concerned that it may threaten our materialist worldview. And, we've all been brought up with an idea that there is a valid world out there. Edgar Mitchell went to explore the great, outer world. And it wasn't until his return to Earth that he had this epiphany that triggered his inner world and this whole pursuit of consciousness. So Charlie was really committed to the idea that a big part of the replication problem was this fear that we were challenging the dominant paradigm, that idea of materialism. I think he also felt that, like William James, like Frederick Myers, that it threatened our ego. And, you referred to this, you didn't want your dad to know your inner world. Well, we all think we are this animated self with opinions and perspectives, but if we're all fundamentally interconnected, and we have access to our own and each other's interiority, what does that mean for that perception of self? So I think that's another thing that, people get triggered by is, wanting to maintain that autonomy. And Psi may challenge us, not only scientifically, but existentially, with this idea that we are something more than just the physical. So I think there is a lot of that. And then grounded in all of that is a fear of madness, a fear that we're going to appear crazy. And, you sure don't want to talk about this with a lot of people. So I think all of those things kind of trigger the challenge. And I don't think it's over. I think people still have these kinds of experiences.
Yeah. I think it is worth mentioning that there's, like with most fears, there's legitimate sides of it as well as parts that you just kind of like to get over and mitigate it. So this question of, is this intrusive thoughts or is this intuition? That kind of discernment is important, and learning tools to do that, that's what is important. Um, Other ways to So that leads me to the idea of ways to mitigate this fear. So we've established that this fear is normal. It's actually very common. It's been talked about for hundreds of years. We understand, and one of the reasons that causes it is just the general fear of the unknown, is threatening the stability and resistance to change. I say that in and of itself is not a reason to push it away, right? That's kind of the thing we want to work to mitigate, to diminish, to open up those boundaries a bit. So some of the tools, so you can think about where to focus to achieve that. And part of it is in your own sense of security. And so we could just talk, kind of popcorn some ideas about how to mitigate it. And the one idea I'm thinking of is just to set clear intentions. So recognizing that this is something that's part of our human nature, and while it can be scary, recognizing that this is something that can help us. And so part of the way to allow that in is to set clear intentions, right? Say, okay, this is part of me that I can explore safely. It doesn't need to threaten my boundaries. We can go at the speed that's, not too fast. So my boundaries move slowly. Um, so these kind of self-hypnosis type of approaches. Um, let's see, any other ways we can mitigate this?
Well, you remind me of the classic book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And, the man won a Nobel Prize for his work in economics. But he
Mm,
also partnered with someone who had a different kind of perspective than he. And I'm a big fan of this idea of adversarial collaborations, the fact that we can come together and work with people whose worldviews may be fundamentally different from our own. But that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is just, a tour de force on all of those things that keep us from really perceiving the world as it is. All the cognitive biases that limit our capacity.
mm,
And his major premise is that, going back to the amygdala, going back to the stresses and strains of modern society, is that we are really under a lot of pressure to make quick decisions and to decide things fast. Um, and I think that one of the things Kahneman said is that that's kind of the default. We're going to do things quickly. And we are biased to make decisions based on what we think and expect to happen, the confirmation bias. And
mm,
so he really advocated that there's two kind of functions in the brain. There's that fast brain that's going to make decisions and decide that can't be true or absolutely that's true. Um, and never really take time to look at, data or go more deeply into what this means to us. But the
mm,
other part of our brain functioning is the slow process, and that's the prefrontal. So moving away from that fight or flight, moving away from those speedy responses that, cause us to make these impulsive decisions that are often really wrong, is slowing down. And as you said, setting intention can be part of it. We also
mm,
know the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so we got to be careful of that. But if we can, and I think this is one of the great contributions of spiritual or wisdom traditions, is the slowing down and allowing our minds and our brains to actually think through the problems or think through the experiences. And so rather than just willy-nilly being defensive,
mm,
one of the things I think that can help people to overcome the fear is, as you said, slowing down, breathing, taking time to let that autonomic response settle in. So
mm.
that's a really great point I think that you're making.